This is episode 124, Thinking Yourself into Jail. Have you ever caught yourself looping on something like an inner dilemma? But the more you loop, the more imprisoned you feel. So in this episode, we'll look at how to break yourself out of thinking jail. Hi, I'm Carly Reer, and this is the MindStory Speaker Podcast. So I woke up in the middle of the night looping on something. My heart started racing, my mind was on overdrive. Now, I usually loop when I have inner conflict about something. In this case, I received business advice that sounded good, but my heart wasn't in it. And the outcome was high stakes for me. So I started arguing with myself. And the more I argued, the more entangled I got. I literally felt like a cat who's now so entangled in a ball of yarn that it's like stuck. So the title of this podcast, Thinking Yourself into Jail, actually comes from the lyrics of this great old Indigo Girls song. In case you remember it, it's called Hammer and a Nail, and it is really about taking action rather than just overly thinking about things. And at the beginning of the chorus goes, I got to get out of bed, get a hammer and a nail, learn how to use my hands, not just my head, 'cause I think myself into jail. And that song lyric stuck with me for years. And anytime I'm in jail with my thoughts, I remember it's a good time to take action. In my case, that often means just walking, moving, or especially writing out the thoughts on both sides of the argument. And that way it can trigger critical thinking, the kind of whole brain perspective and heart-based logic that I've talked about in other episodes. It's where you can see beyond the duality of a situation to a transformational idea that includes both sides but transcends them both to this new level of wisdom. So we all go there sometimes, lost in thoughts we don't want to be having, digging ourselves into this entangled feeling of being in jail with our thoughts. So here's an interesting perspective on it all. What if compulsive and involuntary thinking that puts you in a state of turmoil could be a hidden gift? Like hearkening the beginning of a transformation. Because we don't often transform our way of being or make big important changes in our lives unless we are triggered, compelled, activated by some kind of inner or outer conflict. But at the time, it can feel like an addiction to thinking that's not fruitful, not creative, not actually solving your problem. And often the thinking feels destructive rather than constructive. And maybe it's keeping you up at night, darkening your mood, keeping you not taking action on anything important in your life. And maybe you're even indulging in other things to quell your anxiety, like too much food or other substances or activities to dull the pain. And it's the kind of thinking that actually creates more problems if it keeps going round and round and round and round in an argumentative way inside your head for too long. Now, often it's either based on old ego programs battling it out together or an old ego program butting up against a new, more creative thought form. But if you can get into the role of inner mediator, like a counselor who helps couples solve a conflict, this can help. It's where you direct all that turmoil in a constructive direction. It's kind of like in the lab when you're in science class and you put two compounds into a beaker and then they start bubbling and boiling, but then create something new. That's what we're going for here. So the first step is to realize the pattern of inner conflict is going on, because people usually just feel it as a symptom, like this tightness in their chest or their heart or their stomach or a headache or some kind of agitation or even buzzing sensation like in the back of their head. So you just need to go into diagnosing your symptoms and tracing back to the thoughts creating the sensations. And as soon as you go into that mode of diagnostician, you're moving out of the survival brain, which is creating all that, and into the neocortex, the forebrain, enough to get control of the process. Then you start to access the muscle of the higher mind, which is a powerful creator. That part of us loves to be creative, and often when we aren't being creative or aren't allowing ourselves a creative outlet in some way, it can fester inside and become these destructive thought patterns. So that's the first part. The second part is to not try to stop the conflict inside. It's like if you've ever tried to stop two children from fighting by shouting at them. This can actually exacerbate the conflict. It's better to let go of your resistance to having this inner turmoil. Just be with it. Now, it seems counterintuitive, but it's often our resistance that has us wound up, entangled, imprisoned by the thoughts as much as the thoughts themselves. And as I've said on other episodes, most humans are in an almost continuous state of not wanting what is and wanting something else that seems to be more important at some future point in time. So when you make the present moment your friend to say yes to whatever arises in the moment is the second step to unraveling it. So that might look like just putting all your attention on the inner turmoil wherever it manifests physically, mentally, or emotionally. Just pay attention to the thoughts without judging them, without judging yourself, just paying attention to the emotions arising without trying to stop yourself from feeling them. Pay attention to the pain, the agitation, the numbness, because your attention is like the sunlight. It can purify, dry out, unravel, and enlighten the darkness and start the transformation process. So then the third part is to just get into action in some way. So sometimes a walk in nature followed by writing things out is very effective, whatever works for you. Writing things out, as I said, helps you look at what's going on in the mind and emotions and body so you can get some distance from it and develop a kind of neutrality to the situation where you are activating this inner mediator or diagnostician. And that's when you can see patterns. You can remember times when this happened before and how you unraveled it last time. You can start to recognize the meaning you're creating that may or may not be true about the situation. So that brings us to the fourth part, which is to ask yourself, especially this mediator, which is kind of this higher mind part, what is the gift? What is the benefit of this turmoil? What's good about this situation I find myself in? Where can it lead me that would be constructive? What am I meant to learn here? Now, this is a tough one for some people to accept, especially if they feel particularly victimized by a situation like an illness or intense pain or someone else's selfish behavior or even a worldwide situation that's putting them at an extreme disadvantage. But it's the kind of life philosophy that can be quite empowering and cause you to look for learning, do the learning, grow, and makes the whole thing dissolve and move on. To not have that philosophy keeps you stuck in complaining and blaming others for the negative state you find yourself in. That said, often the first phase of thinking yourself out of jail is to acknowledge that you might be feeling victimized. And it's okay that you're feeling that way. So you don't want to judge yourself for feeling that way. Many of us go there sometimes. But once you recognize it, it's easier to then choose something more empowering. You start to go into this neutral witness of the situation. It's not owning you. Because if you judge yourself for feeling like a victim, then you're getting into this victim-villain relationship with yourself. So the trick is to just rise above it all, see all those roles we take on as just choices, as just parts we are playing in the mind story of our life, and change characters and scripts where necessary. For example, in the Triunity self-coaching model that I teach, we have a reference chart of archetypes and core scripts, disempowering and empowering ones. So in the list of popular disempowering archetypes and scripts that are often involved in inner turmoil, common characters that make you think yourself into jail are the victim, as I talked about, whose core script is bad things keep happening to me, or the slave, whose core script is I'm oppressed, or the coward, whose core script is I'm too afraid, weak, closed to handle this. The wounded one is I'm just too broken inside to handle what life brings me. And I've experienced all of those at some point in my life. I think we go on the journey of life to try all these characters on, put their costumes on, try on the script, see how it is, and see if we want to keep it or not. But if you think that's the only way to be, you're really missing out on the adventure of life. is what I'm saying. So there are several others that are disempowering, but these seem to come up a lot when people are unraveling inner conflict like this, where they thought themselves into jail. So during this process of unraveling, it helps to activate the more empowering or light versions of these archetypal energies, like the guardian, whose core script is, I can protect myself and others, the sovereign, which is different than royalty, but it's like the sovereign whose core script is, I'm free to create the life I want. So you can be thinking about whether, you have either of those scripts running your life. I can protect myself and others. I'm free to create the life I want. Do you believe that? Or the adventure, I'm strong, courageous, and open-minded. So how often do you find yourself thinking that way? Or the healed, which is, I'm healed and whole enough to handle the challenges life brings. So it's interesting to kind of see what scripts are running in the background as you deal with these challenges that life brings. Because if you live in a dualistic world like we do, chances are you have both programs, the disempowering and the empowering. But you are the writer of the story of your life, which you might know intellectually, but it's good to be reminded, and you can therefore cast yourself in any role you want, no matter what situation you face. And sometimes there's a benefit to being the victim, the slave, the coward, the wounded. There are lessons to be learned in those parts of the story. It's just if you get stuck there, as I said, looping around in these disempowering characters and want a way out. So it helps to rewrite the story you are acting out, to make it conscious, to be the director of this story. Case in point, I was working with a business coach who suggested a way of marketing my business that had been very successful for him and many other people who use it. When I expressed my discomfort with it, he said that it was just fear of the unknown, not seeing how well it could work. So I agreed to go along with it, but before I launched it, I was having a sleepless night. Something about it wasn't right to me. It just wasn't the way I wanted to bring my information to the world, even if it was a tried and true method. I needed to unravel whether it was just fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of success, or was it actually a wise part of me steering me in a direction that had more integrity for who I was, what I was trying to do, and who I was trying to be in the world. I just looped on it internally, tossing and turning, until I finally got up in the middle of the night. I did some stretches, then I pulled out my journal and used a self-coaching process to discover the characters in the conflict. What are their core scripts? What was the lesson that needed to be learned here? And it ended up being a combination of fears driving the discomfort. Some fears were unfounded, and some were important to pay attention to. So if I hadn't done this diagnostic process of all these symptoms of agitation and sleeplessness, I wouldn't have come to the grand learning and realization that I needed to rejig the process to make it work for me. Now, it's often easier to just follow prescribed processes that others give you, but if you really want to feel in alignment on your journey, sometimes you have to go through these entangled processes of thinking yourself into jail and then go through the unraveling process. And then you actually transform the whole situation. You get creative and find new solutions that you never would have found if you hadn't gone on that adventure, if you hadn't got entangled in the first place, where you then learn to shine the flashlight on these knots and jail cells of the mind. So don't resist or fear those times you have been thinking yourself to jail. See them as a hidden gift, because once you put on your detective hat and discover what's really there to learn, it can be a fascinating process. Just make sure you don't try to do it in your head while lying in bed. Like, pull out some paper, activate whole brain, whole heart thinking, and that's when you'll start to see amazing, insightful, wise, creative solutions to the inevitable challenges that come your way and will keep coming your way, because that's the game we seem to have signed up for here. So do check out MindStory Inner Coach book and try using our 5-part Avara self-coaching model to break free of a habit of thinking yourself to jail. Just go to mindstoryacademy.com or see the link in the show notes. Now, some people use the 5-part Avara model anytime they're in a negative loop, and it just takes a few minutes and boom, they're out of it, either right away or within half an hour or an hour. it starts to dissipate completely and they start to go on a more constructive path in terms of their thinking, finding new creative solutions. So just to let you know, I will only be doing one more episode of the MindStory Speaker Podcast, which is the next one, episode 125. I've started a new podcast called the Golden Age Timeline Podcast, which will cover some of the things that we talked about here, but I'm going off in another direction, what you might call even more woo-woo territory. I feel it's important at this time in history to start to acknowledge our intuitive skills in a very profound way to help us navigate these very confusing times. I don't think we can rely on only external sources of information. We need to tap into our inner wisdom, our inner truth, and break free of mindsets, attitudes, and mind stories that no longer serve. So we can take back sovereign control of our minds, our bodies, our lives to create the life we were truly meant to live. So I will bring on guests and discuss topics that might be controversial for some, but I feel need to be addressed about what's really happening in the world and how to best navigate our way through it in the best possible way for all concerned. So I understand if this is not your cup of tea, and if so, thank you for listening to this episode or any of the others that you've listened to on the MindStory Speaker Podcast, and maybe we will reconnect at another point in time. But if you're curious about what I cover, I hope you can join me. You can subscribe or just check out the Golden Age Timeline podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Stitcher, Libsyn, or of course our goldenagetimeline.com website and several other platforms. You just have to type in Golden Age Timeline and you'll probably find it. So in general, the theme of the show is this. The world is splitting off into different timelines depending on how you focus your mind. In fact, it's always done that, but more so now than ever. So the show is about how to choose to leave what I consider to be a kind of control matrix and transition into a higher, more benevolent, or what I like to call golden age timeline that really supports humanity to fulfill on their life purpose, for example. And each day you have a choice about whether you want to continue to be controlled or to take back your freedom. And if life is a game, then I believe we are in final exam time. The intense scenarios happening on the world stage are designed to teach wise discernment. It's to wake you up so you can get back a life of purpose and meaning. And if you're already aware of some of this, then I believe you are meant to lead and help others. So it's about helping you find and develop your purpose in this new golden age timeline, as many people are walking away from jobs, careers, businesses that either no longer serve or will no longer be relevant in this new era in human history. So we explore how to shift subconscious mind stories, enhance your intuition and other dormant abilities to get clarity on your mission and purpose, to overcome procrastination and build authentic self-confidence. So you'll find an intersection of career, business clarity, personal growth, emotional well-being, spiritual development, and creative self-expression, where we'll be exploring many of the concepts found in the novel Heliotropous. So check it out if you're interested. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you one last time.